Hey, good evening, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to our weekend Q&A. And we will. I'm going to show a little bit of the um, DFY Live Masterclass, and I'll there's a little story behind that. And typically, I will record um, for unrestricted rights. I will record the live masterclass as kind of a PowerPoint presentation that I do based on the subject, based on marketing principles. And I decided to approach it a little differently. I decided to do it backwards. I decided to record it first. I was going to show it here. And then I got sidetracked using some of the video tools. Like I still have Pictory, even though I said I was going to get rid of it. I still have it. I started to play around with using my voice plus the AI inside of Pictory. And so I probably spent on uh way too long on the process. So I probably will not be doing this kind of DFY live masterclass again, but I will show you some of it tonight. Now, if you're going to get all of it, obviously you'll need to get the um, DFY Live Masterclass for AI for Kids. So I'll show you. It's going to look different than what I normally do. I typically will do a PowerPoint presentation, as I said. Um, this is kind of processed a little bit more than I normally do it, but it's still me doing a live presentation, just so you'll know. I just um, did more with it. And as I said, I probably won't be doing this again. So can everybody see my screen? What do you see? Can everybody see my screen? Yes. Yeah, I was able to go over what you missed, Suzanne. Okay, so let's just I'll just kind of show you this. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it. I think you will be able to, but I hope it plays. So let's just see if it plays. As you start to teach how to use AI and you're going to teach children, you're going to have to do it obviously age appropriately. But probably one of the most important aspects of this is that you want to make sure they understand that this is not going to be free. There are going to be a lot of platforms that they're going to come in contact with. They may start out free, but typically at some point they're going to need to be paid for. And that's going to be an important element that you want to make sure that your student understands. As of the recording of this, OpenAI, which runs ChatGPT, they're losing about $700,000 per day. And you might think, well, that's not necessarily relevant to my student using AI, but actually it is. And you want to make sure that they understand that you're going to be paying for it, that it's not going to be something that they're just going to get unlimited use of, and they're not going to have any limits, and no one's going to be paying for it. It does have to be paid for. And what you also have to be getting them ready for is the fact that the price could rise. And so what they're experiencing right now, they have to expect that as wonderful as it is, as wonderful as the things that they are doing, they're probably going to have to pay more in the future. And so if you can get them ready and get them to understand this in an age appropriate way, it's a very good reality check for them, regardless of what age they are. AI is going to present them with some great opportunities. And typically at the school level, schools may be involved in giving. Okay, so you get the idea. So um, that is the that is this that's the DFY Live Masterclass for AI for Kids, and that's and that's primarily what I think the bonuses that I do will be looking like. That's what I think they're going to be looking like. And as I said, I probably spent way too much time taking that live presentation and turning it into that. But so that'll be that'll be for this time. So this week's will not look like it typically does. It's still done generically, and there's nothing in there that's personal. So uh, let's see. The bonuses for AI for kids. Well, let's see. What I think Notion, the course, my Notion course was the bonus, and for the upgrade, let me see. I don't know if everybody can see your question, so let me turn on everyone so everybody can see the question. Um, I think that the bonus Santu was the my Notion course on the front end. On the back end, I can't remember exactly honestly what it was. It was another set of courses. And then for the yeah, yeah. Yep. I think I did a bundle for the DFY Live Masterclass. I think that's what I did. All right. Okay, yeah, and then Suzanne, in answer to your question, I did answer your question on the private call. I will be posting that inside the insider area. So um, we went over the platform from, putting the link in there, and I put over the connection to ThriveCard. Yeah, so this time, Santu, I did not do an advanced set of videos. There was not enough for me to do. I'm probably going to be doing, okay, so let me just say, I did not do an advanced set of videos for AI for kids. There really wasn't enough without repeating myself. So there's one set of tutorial videos. I typically will do an advanced course. I didn't do that this time. There was not enough there. So there is the basic, and then there's the advanced, or the not the or the live masterclass, which is what you just saw on screen, right? The live masterclass, which is different. Typically, it is a PowerPoint presentation. I keep it generic on purpose, but as I said, I started working with, trying to experiment with Pictory to see if it would be faster. It was a lot slower, so I won't be doing that again. So, uh, okay. Any other questions? Any questions? And I had intended to kind of talk longer, but I will take questions. What I want to do from now on is kind of do a little more training on setting up on Warrior Plus, and I think I'm going to start doing that on YouTube a little more. So, um, but whatever questions that you have tonight, please feel free to write them in the box, and I will do the best I can to answer them. Like I said, um, let me see if I can. I will see if I can pick that up a little more. Um, let's see. I'm going to turn back. I'll turn on one more of the videos here. I'll pick up one of the. I'll pick up the conclusion. Right. I'll pick up the conclusion of the DFY. All right. So this is the conclusion of the DFY. So I'll just show you. I think it's like 3 minutes. So 3 minutes. I'll come back. So how do we conclude everything that we've been talking about here in this session? First, of course, AI needs to be age appropriate. So you want to make sure that you understand who your student is. You want to understand what their limits are, what they can handle, and then be willing to give them enough autonomy while at the same time giving them enough supervision so that using AI will not shipwreck them. AI is a wonderful tool, but it's not yet regulated. There aren't a lot of filters. And unless you are intentional about making sure that it is age appropriate for your student, that's just not going to happen all by itself. AI needs to be useful. That means that you can create just about anything in terms of text, in terms of digital. However, thinking about how to use AI to better people's lives. That's the level at which you want to think of. And there really are no limits. If you think about something that should be developed, something that could be manufactured, AI can teach them how to get things with little or no resources and to actually go through the building process. And so AI needs to be useful and they need to be thinking big and broad about solutions for other people. AI is a tool and not the end. AI is not going to be magic. It's not going to do things all by themselves. The more knowledge your student brings to the table, the more that they've studied, the more that they understand what it is they're doing, the more they understand who they're designing solutions for, the better AI is going to be at helping them to get to that destination. AI can assist in written communications, but it alone will not teach a student how to communicate in person. There is a cognitive process to understanding something so that you can explain it. That's still something that generates. Okay, so you get the idea. Um, okay, so I'll tell you how I did that. Um, yeah, no, that's a great question. So Jane's asking who matched the audio. There's so many steps to this that I'm ashamed that I even thought that this was going to be easier and faster. Can I just tell you if depending on if you're watching this and you get the DFY, the normally our DFY live masterclass, it literally took me 2.5 times longer to do that than the PowerPoint. And I thought it was going to be faster. Okay, so here's the process. Um, uh, so I thought that I could narrate because I knew what I wanted to say about this. And so I thought I could narrate without a PowerPoint. That was the first mistake. So and what I know that and I figured out was that the PowerPoint is really more for you than it is for me. So I had to at least put my points back down at a minimum level. Now I'll show you what I did. Now I didn't write out let's see if I can find that PowerPoint. Um typically uh I will I will write this thing uh let's see, where's that thing? Okay, I don't know if you can see my screen, but let me see. I'll show you. So this is what I did instead of, right? So tip and so this almost turns out to be what I normally do because I was scrambling to try to figure out what I was going to say. So that was the first mistake that I really do need an outline. And even though I speak extemporaneously, I need that outline. So I went back and I wrote the outline while I'm trying to record this. So I finally got the audio recorded. And I recorded the audio one module at a time because instead of just recording it all at one time, I knew that Pictory couldn't handle 45 minutes. The maximum I can create in the video is 20 minutes, but yeah, I don't know if you know anything about um, AI voices or AI. If you put something inside of an AI, the audio will start to degrade the longer it goes. So sometimes anything beyond 2 or 3, 4, 5 minutes, even if the voice is perfect, even if it's it'll start to degrade. So generally, 5 minutes is about the limit before you have to start piecing things together. So I knew I had to do this video by doing it in 8 parts. So I knew I had to do it in 8 parts instead of one video. So I recorded 8 parts. That took longer, obviously, but okay. So I eventually finished that. I produced the audio for all 8 parts, and so I had to go through the editing process to make sure that it was close to perfect, right? So I had to go through that close to perfect, and so I was able to produce all 8 pieces. Then um what I do, and I'll show you a little bit of this, uh, if I can. I'll see if I can kind of get this inside of Chat GPT to show you without burning up my bandwidth here. Okay, let's go inside of here, and I'm gonna show you. I'll show you uh, audio transcription. Oh, so here's basically what I did. So we're now inside of Chat GPT. So I took the MP4, it's my voice, the MP3, my voice, the SRT and the TXT file I get from searching, but that's basically the transcript. So I took the transcript, I then upload all of this to ChatGPT. What I asked ChatGPT to do, because I know that a machine transcription is not going to be perfect, what I asked the chatbot to do is to make it as perfect as possible and let it know I'm going to put it inside a pictory. So it tries to get it as close, and I say in my prompt I want it to be word for word, and so it tries to do that, and then I had to go back and I had to say, okay, well, I want you to put one line at a time on, make the format one line at a time, so I could cut and paste it and put it in Pictory. Because if your sentences are too long in Pictory or in an AI, it's not going to go. It's not going to work right. The sentences have to be short. So I still wanted it to be word for word. I just wanted to break up the sentences, make it short. And so what ChatGPT is doing is giving me a script to put inside a Pictory. But the the step in here is that I have to ask this thing to make the sentences short in order to put back into Pictory. So, and and good Lord. Um, and so I did that 8 times over. At this point, what normally takes me 2 hours, I'm a day into this. I thought, yes, exactly, Jane. I mean, you know, I'm literally a day into this. So I thought to myself, this is just, and then and so by the time I got that deep into it, I couldn't stop because I was already committed, right? And I kept thinking, okay, I'm already halfway through this. I have to keep going. Would it have been easier to edit the slides inside a Pictory and break up the sentences? Well, yes and no, because inside a Pictory, the way you have to do it is you have to click inside of each element and you have to break it into pieces. Um, that's not always uh, a fast process. So they have a very specific way. You have to click split, and then so what I could have done is, yes, I could have done it before, but before I put the script in there, I could have gone in and cut it in half. But this is faster than that part. But if I put it in Pictory and I try to break it inside of there, that process is not as fast. So really getting Chat GPT to do that is the fastest way to do it because I didn't have to manually do it. So going back and asking the chat bot, okay, now that you've given me the script and you've cleaned up the audio, now I want you to do is to make the sentences shorter. That quite honestly, that was the easiest thing I did. So uh so okay. So I got so then I've literally got um 8 scripts. And so then I went to Pictory and I did each one. So at that point, when I started the process, what I thought I wanted was to emulate a handwriting, right? They don't have that in Pictory. That's only in Sparkle, Video Scribe, Powtoon, and I think it's something else. There's another one that does it too. But I said, okay, but I'll try to get as close to it as I can. Well, that was starting to take that was starting to take way too long uh, to select each one. So I settled on, okay, so each each block will have one image. Well, then I didn't like the images that Pictory came up with. I didn't like the videos. I didn't like the images. So I then went back to the chatbot and I said, I'll show you this. If I can. So then I said, produce me an image. So I said, based on the content in the, am I visual now? No, I'm not. I'll show you my screen. So here's what I said. I said, okay, now based on the content, create an image for me to use in Pictory. One image per video, right? And I promise you this is not shorter. So uh and then now how many of you all know that DALL-E doesn't know how to spell? I know that there are ways you can get it to do, and I actually did a video that can't spell worth nothing, right? So what you have to do in Chat GPT, I don't know if you all know this, is you click inside an image, right? It opens up the image, and then you can edit, right? You can edit in Chat GPT. So that's what I did. So I edited each image where it misspelled stuff, and then I went and got it to spell right. Or I just said take the words out. So um, in this case, like see that image, see where it has direct response and all kinds of junk. Uh, I then went here and then I used the Chat GPT image editor. And I said, take out all the, I said, take out all the words. I highlighted it, took out all the words that were misspelled. So you see this, right? You see this one, right? See all those places where this thing is and that thing is. And then I took out all those words here. I may be able to show it to you, Suzanne. It could be a bandwidth issue. I'm going to try. I'll try it. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so it's not responding to me when I click this. Okay. Okay, so what I then do is you go to this little thing here and you select. That's going to give you this thing, right? So then I say, I go here, I go here, every place where it misspelled something. And then I then say, and then I write a message here and I tell it what I want it to do, right? So then this is where I will say, well, I told it to take out all those words, right? So in that area right down to the bottom right is where you tell it what you want to do, right? Um, so yeah, so that's pretty much what you do. You click on the image, you open up the editor, you highlight what you want to change, and then yeah, it'll take it out. So let's say well now I hope that I'm this is gonna work bandwidth wise. All right, so let's say I want to um see I just write no text. I give it as little uh so it's only going to be based on what I'm trying to highlight here. So I'm saying no text. I don't like to talk to chatbots. This is not my friend. So I don't want to talk to it like it's my friend. No text. And then we'll see what it does. It's not responding fast because, because of Zoom, but it's going to try to do something. All right, we'll see what it does. Again, could be a bandwidth thing, but what's it going to try to do? Yeah, well, yeah. Suzanne says I will sometimes write please, but I don't treat this thing like it's my friend. Now, what I will say is that I do use voice right now. If you're not using voice, okay, so here we go. Okay, see, now I didn't really do what I wanted to do. I said no text, and ordinarily what I would do is I would just go back. I'd do this again, right? So it apparently did not understand. Let's take that out. I don't want that. Okay, okay, I'll try that. I'll say delete text and see if it deletes. All right. So, okay, so that's how I created the images that went on for each, that, that went into each portion of the DFY. And so, um, okay, yeah, take care, Jim. Good to see you. Uh, and so each portion of this thing is, you know, was this process. So that's why it took 2.5 days when it could have taken 2.5 hours. Let's see if it's going to do. And it'll be 7:30 after that. So then after that, we will cut out. So uh, now, as a reminder, while this is chewing, I'm going to say that if you haven't gotten our bonus for um, Midjourney, you can go to the plrshow.com/Angela M. And what I'm going to be teaching your customers in that bonus is um, how to take the Midjourney images that you create and turn them into videos. So that's what that bonus is going to be about. Let's see. Did it come there? Okay, there it did. Okay, so it did. Okay, so there's the image. The bonus is for Angela. Apparently, I don't know her all that well, and I don't like people contacting me on Facebook, but she contacted me on Facebook, and she's kind of tied into the people at Midjourney. She knows them. I don't know. She does something for them, and so she did a course on the new interface. Now, just so as you'll know, I will be doing my own on the same thing so that you can sell it. And so I'm not gonna watch your course. I'm not gonna read it because I've got to do my own. So she gave me a review copy, and I thought, okay, well, it looks to be good. A lot of people say it's good, and so I did. And the only reason I did not read it fully is because I don't want to use hers to do mine, right? So okay, so now you see the image, right? So we cleaned up that misspelling, and so you can do that all inside of Chat GPT. All that can be done there. All right. So once again, the plrshow.com/AI for kids. And then also the plrshow.com/Angela M is my bonus for the Midjourney thing, right? And I will have a PM newsletter coming out this evening, not for Ultimate Insiders, but everybody else. My newsletter will be coming out this evening, and it'll have all the part of PLR in there. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for hanging out with me. I deeply appreciate you all. Appreciate you all hanging out with me, kind of going through this process that took me, as I said, 2 days, but it should have taken me 2 hours. Have a great night, a pleasant tomorrow. Take care.